Oh, stretch fabric. It's flexible, it's comfortable, it comes in tons of cool patterns and colors, and it can be a real nightmare to sew. We're going to talk about that today. Alright, so first things first, let's talk about some tools that are super helpful when dealing with stretch fabrics. Number one, your friend is going to be your rotary cutter. Now, I have a hard time cutting around rounded edges. Some people are just really good at it. I do end up still using scissors for that. The reason the rotary cutter is helpful is that when you go to cut with scissors, when you pull the fabric up, that's now stretching the fabric. So if your fabric has a lot of stretch, that can make a bit of a difference in getting a cut where you need to have it. The second thing I want to talk about is make sure that you have the right needle. There are needles for all different kinds of fabric. If you're sewing with jersey or with a stretch, then make sure that you have a jersey or a stretch needle. It can seem like a silly little thing of like, oh, well, it's just a small project. I'll just power through it with my whatever needles in my machine. Just do yourself a favor and use the proper needle. In addition to using a proper stretch fabric needle, there's also the double needle. Now, what makes the double needle so awesome is that you thread your second thread through your machine exactly the same way that you do your first thread. Some people just grab both threads and then pull them both through the machine. I like to completely thread one and then thread the other. I find that I don't get tangles, or it just kind of alleviates any problems that could come from that. Now what happens with the double needle is you wind up with 2 rows of stitching that are even, and then on the back side you have a zigzag that is connecting those rows of stitching, and that zigzag will also end up being your finish on your raw edge of your hem. Now, if your machine doesn't have a spot to put a second thread, you may need, this is what my machine actually came with, and there's a little hole at the top of my machine, and I can just put this in, and that's where my secondary thread sits. If you don't have a secondary thread spool holder, you can absolutely just wind yourself a second bobbin. And then if your bobbin winder is at the top of your machine, and then you can just run your second thread from a bobbin. It does mean that you're going to have to stop and refill that bobbin as well as refill your other bobbin, but in a pinch it'll work. Now, probably the thing that is my most favorite is this. This is a walking foot. Now you can use a walking foot on pretty much any machine. On my machine I don't have the possibility of decreasing the pressure of my presser foot, so that's when this walking foot comes in to play. So you may have noticed when you are working with stretch fabric that sometimes the feed dogs pulling the fabric from beneath will end up pulling the bottom piece of fabric more than the top piece. So that's what this is for. This is to help pull that top piece. That's just a feed dog that's going to work on your top piece of fabric, the same way the feed dogs in your machine work on the bottom piece of fabric. So this will help guide it through evenly. All right, let's talk about setting our machines up for sewing stretch fabric. Now, oftentimes most machines will they'll either have a dial over here, or they'll have a screw up here that can adjust the pressure that the presser foot puts down. I have been through my manual a million times. I have Googled it. There is no such adjustment for my machine. There is on mine, however, a feed balancing dial. So there's just a screw in here that I can adjust, and it corrects any stretch stitch that is distorted. Obviously, there are other factors that come into play: how fast you're trying to sew, how many layers you're trying to sew. But what I've found is that although I can't adjust the amount of pressure in my presser foot, adjusting this has really helped me with my stretch stitch. So if you don't have that adjustment, look for this. Please excuse this interruption. Future editing Stephanie here. I just wanted to give a full disclosure on my machine and some of the problems that I have with stretch fabric and some things that I've learned in choosing a machine. Now, When I chose the machine that I have, which is the Janome QDC 2030, I was doing a lot of quilting, and when I was sewing garments, it was typically Halloween costumes. I was doing stage costumes, a lot of corsetry, stuff like that. A lot of more rigid fabrics. If I was doing anything stretch, I was like adding elastic to stuff with a zigzag stitch, which, I mean, that's a no-brainer. Any machine can do that. However, I was not sewing like jersey and stretch fabrics. So what I have learned in shopping for a machine is, number one, just look for a machine that allows you to release the pressure on your presser foot. It just makes so much difference. When my machine was being serviced, I was using my sister-in-law's machine for a few videos, and it just does make a world of difference in the puckering of your seams. Number two, being a digital machine, all my stitches are pre-programmed. Now, a lot of stitches, like my straight stitch and zigzags and all the decorative stitches, I have tons of leeway in choosing my stitch length and my stitch width. However, for whatever reason, on my stretch stitch, I don't. And that's with the triple stretch stitch and the lightning stitch. I'm not allowed to choose the length of those stitches. And that makes a big difference as well in the puckering and the elasticity of that particular stitch. So what I find is my stitches on my machine, they don't actually have a lot of give to them. So it's a very unpractical machine for doing stretch fabric. So a couple of things to keep in mind if you are looking to purchase a machine. All right, so to install my walking foot, I'm actually going to just hand crank and bring down my needle holder, just about halfway. And I need to do that because this little arm has to go on top of that, all right? So there we go. And I will tighten that up. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a stretch needle. Now I can bring my my needle head all the way back up so that I can get my needle in there. And I'm going to really tighten that because since that arm for my walking foot is sitting on there, it gives a little extra vibration, and it's you have a better chance of your needle actually coming out of your machine. So just make sure that that's super tight. A couple other things to think about when you're sewing with stretch fabric, and this fabric is really stretchy. It's a 4-way stretch. So I have my fabric that is yet to be sewn sort of puddled in front of my machine, so it's not hanging down off of the table because that's going to stretch it some more. And I'm making sure that as my garment makes its way through the machine, that it's coming out straight here. I'm not letting it kind of like get pulled off to the side because that will affect your seam as well. And when I do so, I'm just letting the machine, I mean, I've got feed dogs on top and bottom. There should be no need to pull my fabric or push it through or manipulate it in any way. The machine should just do the work. The only thing that I am doing is I'm making sure that I'm guiding the fabric sort of up over the edge so that I know that I'm not getting any pull from the fabric sort of cascading over the front of the machine here. Well, there you have it. Those are the tips and tricks I use when I'm sewing with stretch fabric. Now, is that list comprehensive? By no means. There's tons of stuff that people do. This is just what has worked for me with my machine, with the fabric that I've been sewing, and had I known this stuff when I started sewing with stretch fabric, I probably would have like not wanted to rip my hair out quite as much. So I really hope that this has helped you out, because taking stretch fabric out of your repertoire, it can limit you. There's just things that you can't do unless your fabric has a little bit of give to it. So do all the things. Like, share, subscribe, hit that dingy bell so that you know when I have another video drop, and I will see you next week.